The box that blows icy wind. Yuga woke up as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the cave entrance. He stretched on the animal skins that served as his bed and rubbed his eyes with the back of his hands. Another day was beginning, and he could already feel the characteristic heat of that time of year, when the sun burned brightly and hunting became more difficult. She was known in her tribe as the best tracker. Her eyes could identify footprints that others didn't even notice, and her sense of smell detected the presence of animals at impressive distances. But in recent days, something strange had been happening in her cave. It all began 3 moons ago, when strange men appeared carrying boxes and tools that made frightening noises. They spoke a language Yuga didn't understand and pointed inside her cave, gesturing excitedly. At first, she tried to scare them away with screams and stones, but they kept returning, always in their colorful clothes and bright yellow helmets. One day, tired of resisting and curious about all the activity, Yuga allowed them to enter. She watched from afar as they drilled holes in the stone walls, pulled out long, colorful wires, and installed a rectangular white box on the highest wall of the cave. The box had a kind of grid on the front and shone under the light of the torches. The men pressed a few buttons, waved excitedly, and left, leaving Yuga alone with that mysterious object. For days, she simply ignored it. The box sat there, silent and motionless, like a peculiar stone stuck to the wall. Yuga even considered removing it, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was instinctive respect for something that clearly didn't belong to the world she knew. On that particular morning, however, everything changed. Yuga was preparing her spear for the daily hunt when she heard a click. It was a low sound, almost imperceptible, but in the stillness of the cave it echoed like distant thunder. She froze, gripping the spear tightly, her muscles tense and ready to react to any threat. Then came the roar. A deep, continuous, and menacing sound began to emanate from the white box. Yuga let out a scream and ran to the back of the cave, pressing himself against the rocky wall. His wide eyes couldn't look away from the box. What was that thing? Was it a trapped spirit? A beast from another world? The roar continued, steady and relentless. Yuga could see the cage bars trembling slightly. And then, to his utter horror, the thing began to blow. A cold wind, as icy as the river water in the mountains, began to emanate from the box and spread through the cave. Yuga had never felt anything like it. On warmer days, she sought shade and cool water, but this was different. It was as if winter itself had been captured and released inside her home. Trembling with fear and confusion, Yuga cowered even further against the wall. The icy wind reached her bare feet, and she jumped, letting out a sharp cry. It was too cold. How could something be so cold in the middle of summer? For long minutes, she remained paralyzed, observing the box with a mixture of terror and fascination. The wind continued to blow, and gradually the temperature in the cave began to drop. Yuga could see her own breath forming small clouds in the air, something that only happened on the coldest winter mornings. "Evil spirit," she cried in her ancient tongue. "Get out of my house. This cave is mine." But the box didn't respond, it just continued its constant roar and its icy breath. Yuga decided he needed to act. He couldn't simply let that thing dominate his cave. He grabbed his longest spear and, keeping his distance, began to carefully poke at the box. The tip of the spear struck the white surface with a hollow sound. Nothing happened. The box remained impassive, blowing its icy wind. Encouraged by the lack of violent reaction, Yuga moved a little closer. The cold wind hit her face directly, and she recoiled quickly, gasping. It was so intense. As if 1,000 winters had been concentrated in that gust. Her long, tangled hair was blown back, and she had to close her eyes to protect it. When she stepped away again, Yuga noticed something strange. Despite the fright, her body was no longer so hot. The oppressive heat that normally dominated the cave at this time of year had decreased considerably. She touched her own skin and noticed that she was no longer sweating. Confused, she sat on the ground, a safe distance from the box, and began to observe it more closely. The roaring continued, rhythmic and constant. The wind blew without stopping. But, as the minutes passed, Yuga began to realize that there was no real threat. The box didn't move. It didn't attack. It just blew. Her breathing began to calm. Her heart, which had been beating frantically, returned to a more normal rhythm. Yuga was a survivor, and survivors learn to distinguish real dangers from things that are merely unknown. Cautiously, she stood up and walked through the cave, always keeping an eye on the mysterious box. The air was definitely cooler. In fact, it was getting too cold. Yuga took one of her bare skins and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was then that she noticed something shining on the wall, near the box. It was a small rectangular object with strange symbols and a red button. The men in colorful clothes had stuck it to the wall before leaving. Yuga approached carefully, studying the object. She pressed the red button. Immediately, the roaring ceased. The wind stopped. The box became completely silent. Yuga let out a sigh of relief so deep that her knees almost buckled. The thing could be switched off. It wasn't an uncontrollable spirit, but something that responded to touch. She laughed, a rough sound of pure relief, and touched the button again. The roar returned. The icy wind began again. Yuga jumped back, but this time he didn't run. He stared at the box with wide, understanding eyes. He pressed the button again. The roar stopped. He pressed it again. The roar returned. Magic, she whispered, amazed. For the next hour, Yuga fiddled with the remote, turning the box on and off repeatedly. Each time he pressed the button, he felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. It was like having control over the weather inside his cave. But the day wore on, and she had responsibilities. The tribe depended on her hunting skills. Reluctantly, Yuga left the box unplugged and left the cave with her weapons, ready to track the day's prey. The walk through the forest was particularly arduous that afternoon. The sun burned mercilessly, and there was no breeze. Yuga sweated profusely, feeling the heat penetrate every pore of her skin. She found deer tracks, followed them for hours, but the heat left her sluggish and irritable. When she finally returned to the village at the end of the afternoon, she was exhausted and empty-handed. As she approached her cave, however, something inside her stirred at the memory. The box. The icy wind. She quickened her pace. Inside the cave, the day's heat had accumulated, making the air heavy and stifling. Yuga ran to the control panel and pressed the red button. The familiar roar filled the cave, and seconds later, the icy wind began to blow. This time, Yuga didn't back down. On the contrary, she walked straight to the front of the box and positioned herself directly in front of the wind. The icy air hit her sweaty body full force, and she closed her eyes, letting out a moan of pure pleasure. It was wonderful. It was incredible. It was as if all the icy rivers of the mountains were blowing over her at once. The sweat on her skin cooled instantly, making her shiver, but it was a good, invigorating shiver. Yuga opened her arms and began to spin slowly, letting the wind caress every part of her body. She laughed loudly, a sound of pure joy. How could she have been afraid of that? That box wasn't a curse, it was a blessing. She spent the rest of the night experimenting with different positions in the cave, discovering where the wind was strongest and where it was gentlest. She realized that if she stayed too long directly in front of the box, she started to feel too cold, but if she moved away a little, the temperature was perfect. That night, for the first time in weeks, Yuga slept comfortably. She didn't wake up sweating in the middle of the night. She didn't have to leave the cave to get fresh air. She simply slept, lulled by the constant roar of the magic box. In the following days, her routine changed completely. She still went out to hunt and gather, but now she could hardly wait to return home. The cave became her favorite refuge, an oasis of coolness amidst the scorching summer heat. Other members of the tribe began to notice the change. Yuga seemed more rested, more cheerful. Her skin was no longer constantly flushed from the heat, and she no longer complained about the hot weather. Borg, the oldest hunter in the tribe, was the first to visit her and inquire about her renewed appearance. When he entered the cave and felt the icy air, his eyes nearly popped out of their sockets. "What kind of magic is this?" he asked, amazed. Yuga, now completely at ease with his magic box, proudly showed him how it worked. He pressed the button, and the roar began. He pressed it again, and it stopped. Borg touched the box reverently, as if he were before a sacred totem. The news spread quickly through the tribe. Soon, everyone wanted to visit Yuga's cave and feel the icy wind. She became a kind of local celebrity, the woman who had tamed the spirit of winter and imprisoned it in a white box. Some people were afraid and kept their distance, believing that messing with such powerful forces could bring bad luck. Others were skeptical and thought Yuga had invented some trick. But most were simply fascinated. Children from the tribe began appearing at the entrance to her cave during the hottest hours of the day, their eyes filled with hope. Yuga, who always had a gentle side despite her rough appearance, allowed them to enter in small groups and feel the icy wind. The children's laughter and joyful shouts filled the cave, and she found herself smiling more than she had in years. Even Grunk, the tribe's leader, came to investigate. He was a large, imposing man, his body covered in scars from countless battles. He entered the cave with a suspicious expression, prepared to find some kind of deception. But when the icy wind hit him, his hard face softened. He stood there for long minutes, simply enjoying the cool air, and then nodded slowly. "The spirits have blessed you, Yuga," he said solemnly. "Use this power wisely." Yuga nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility. But she also felt pride. She, who had always been just another hunter in the tribe, was now the guardian of something special, something unique. As the weeks passed, Yuga developed a routine. She discovered that if she left the box on all the time, the air became too cold and she began to feel uncomfortable. So she created a system. She would turn the box on when the heat became unbearable, leave it running until the cave cooled down, then turn it off for a while. It was a delicate dance, but she learned the rhythms perfectly. She also discovered other buttons on the remote. There were up and down arrows that made the wind stronger or weaker. There were symbols she didn't understand, but which seemed to change something about how the box worked. She carefully experimented with them all, learning through trial and error. One night, during a particularly strong storm, when the wind howled outside and the rain poured down, Yuga sat comfortably in her cave, the box switched off as the weather had cooled. She looked at the white box on the wall and thought about how her life had changed. Before, she feared summer. She feared the heat that left her weak and irritable. But now, she was in control. She had power over her own comfort. And although she didn't fully understand how the box worked, she had learned to respect it and use it. She thought about the strange men who had installed the box. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why did they do this? Yuga had no answers, but she felt gratitude. Perhaps, she thought, they were benevolent spirits disguised as men, come to bring blessings to a weary huntress. Or perhaps they were just men from a distant place, with knowledge that seemed like magic but was, in fact, something more. Not that it mattered much to Yuga. Magic or knowledge, the result was the same. She had a piece of winter in her cave that she could control. That night, as the storm raged outside, Yuga wrapped herself in her furs and closed her eyes, a peaceful smile on her face. The white box remained silent on the wall, patiently waiting for the next warm day. when it would once again be called upon to blow its icy wind and bring relief. And Yuga, who had once reacted with utter terror to that strange object, now couldn't imagine his life without it. He had learned a valuable lesson: not everything that is unknown is dangerous, and not everything that seems frightening is actually a threat. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest gifts come in the strangest packages. And sometimes, all we need is a little courage to overcome the initial fear and discover the wonders that await us on the other side. The box's roar, which had once terrified her, was now the most comforting sound in her world. And the icy wind, which had made her tremble with fear, was now her dearest friend on sweltering summer afternoons. Yuga fell asleep smiling, dreaming of icy winds and magic boxes, grateful for having had the courage not to destroy what she did not understand, and the wisdom to learn to live with the extraordinary.